The way that I like to think of humanity is kind of in a best case scenario light. And I think we have some negative tendencies, and one of those tendencies is not to see beyond our own circle. This is why it's so important that parents with their children step up and be very visible. Because if you're not visible, your leaders in government aren't going to be thinking about you, and even corporations aren't going to be thinking about you.
The climate crisis is escalating. I think that everybody can see it. And inside of the eye of the storm, what do we have? The children of the planet. As a teacher, like many moms and parents and grandparents, I am very concerned about what type of world are we going to hand over to this next generation. And this is why I met with some moms and parents to talk about their network and what they do and what they think and how they talk to each other, and also how they learn to talk to leaders and how they learn how to talk to their own children about climate change.
My name is Laurel Hart. I'm a mother and an organizer of Babies for Climate Action Vancouver. I'm based here in Vancouver, and I'm an artist, educator, and a researcher.
It's a new trend actually. Moms are more and more involved in climate actions. Moms and parents are now connecting on the internet and organized local and international networks. One of them is so big in the USA, they have around 1 million subscribers.
I am Dr. Melissa Lem, and I am a board member of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment and the Director of Parks Prescriptions for the BC Parks Foundation.
And they also want to develop a positive vision.
My name is Ellen Kelsey. I have 2 children, and I have a new book called Hope Matters: Why Changing the Way We Think is Critical to Solving the Environmental Crisis.
Our children are already living some of the effects of climate change. Here in Vancouver, you can see it's a misty day, but it's also a smoky day. I believe that some of our governments aren't preparing quickly enough to look after our children, and especially our babies. It must be a challenge right now when they're trying to look after a pandemic at the same time. So for us as parents, it's our responsibility to form community, to connect with each other, to do the research, and to step up and look after our kids.
So if we don't reduce our carbon emissions now, a child born today will see global warming of 4 degrees Celsius, which could have catastrophic effects on our public health and the environment that sustains us.
I think that mothers are often very attuned to the emotional state that their children are in. And one thing that we know from very many studies is that Children are very concerned about the state of the planet. In fact, some studies show as high as 80% of kids in these studies who feel in some ways like there is no future, like the planet will not be inhabitable for them. And so that concern amongst their children, the people they love the most on Earth, feeling so hopeless is deeply concerning for a lot of parents.
Climate change starts to affect babies even before they're born. So extreme heat increases the risk of premature birth and low birth weights. And also air pollution, which is caused primarily by burning fossil fuels and also worsened by climate change, again, increases the risk of low birth weights and also increases the risk of death in the first 28 days of life. So illness from extreme heat can increase because they have smaller, more developing bodies that don't regulate their temperature as well. And also, whenever there happens to be an extreme weather event like flooding or drought, that threatens our food and water health, and that can increase the risk of severe complications from infectious diseases.
During the first bout of very unsafe air quality that we had, I did a lot of research with other members of the community just into how safe it was for babies and young children. And the reality was it wasn't at all safe. It wasn't the same situation as it is for adults who could possibly go for a walk outside and just not exert themselves. For babies, their lungs are still forming. So as climate change creates all sorts of new hazards for us, we have to remember that these kind of small things that happen on a day-to-day basis are going to have long-term effects on them.
But something also that can happen is direct exposure to PM 2.5 or particulate matter from the smoke. So we know that this increases inflammation in the heart and the lungs, which can increase in increased ambulance calls and ER visits. But what science also suggests is that these small particles can actually pass the blood-brain barrier and get into our brains, where it can cause neuroinflammation and reduce our mood. And something else that's especially relevant to pregnant women is they want to do the best that they can for the health of their babies. So when they're stuck inside because it's not safe to go outside because of the smoke, they can experience increased negative effects on their mood and their mental health because they just can't go outside into nature to exercise.
And it's not just them if we have a sickly population, for example, but of course parents just will do whatever they can to look after their children. So parents, right now, I know you have a lot on your plates. It seems impossible to be adding another thing to what you already have going on. But the reality is, if we don't try to address this now, the amount of issues and problems we're going to be dealing with are going to exponentially increase over time. So, but where do we start when we're already overwhelmed? I think we need to start with a place of hope. If you look back at all that humanity has been doing thousands and thousands of years, you can see that we're able to develop and adapt really quickly. As you watch your kids grow, how quickly they grow, how fast they learn, and what they're capable of already teaching us when they're just a few years old. It's important to realize that we can transform the situation that we're in. So, but let's talk practically. How can you get involved when you're already probably overwhelmed and stressed and tired, especially with this pandemic? One of the best things you can do is to join your local parents' climate activist group.
I think it's really important to children that they see adults working alongside children. What really matters to kids is feeling like they are parts of communities that care about the same things that they do. And one of the things we know about young children, really anyone up to the age of 30, is that climate change is a top priority. Climate change and social justice. And so when kids see adults acting, it matters to them.
There is research showing that kids who spend more time connected to nature and enjoying wild spaces when they're young do grow up to have more pro-environmental behaviors. So there are a number of studies that have questioned young adults and older adults about their childhood nature habits and their current environmental beliefs and behaviors, and they do show there is a significant positive association between particularly the amount of time they spend in wild spaces and how likely they are to be environmentalists as adults. And I think it's incredibly important for us to connect our children to nature when they're young, because they're going to be the next generation of advocates for planetary health.
So there's many different actions that we engage in. One of our primary focuses is awareness of how fossil fuel emissions are the primary driving factors of climate change. So our first event actually was when we took part in the huge climate protest in Vancouver. We were about 5 or 6 days old, and we made a big banner with other handprints from babies and children in the local community. And there were about 50 parents who showed up, and that was just amazing to me that in only 5 days we could have 50 parents show up with their babies at a big event, which is very challenging for parents to do.
One thing about those protests is that parents are exposing their children to different point of views, connecting sometimes the dots in between the way we use our energy and the food systems of First Nations.
My homeland is the Secwepemc territory. As the women of our culture, we have traditional teachings that we are the stewards of the water. The women embody some of the same characteristics as water. Our feminine healing energy that nurtures our families, our communities, our food system, maintains the knowledge, passes that on to the younger generation, is largely a woman's role. And in our culture, the women would be named after some property of water. We take this pipeline a serious threat.
More and more children hear about what is violence, and now they are starting to understand what is a violent economy.
One issue that concerns me a lot is how climate change and Canada's extraction industries disproportionately impacting Indigenous women and girls, and particularly Indigenous young girls and mothers. We recently had a report from the government that showed that anywhere where there's a major extraction project happening often has higher rates of missing and murdered women and children.
This is a huge, huge system, inherently violent. The Environmental Assessment Act is not adequate. The National Energy Board hearings are not adequate. We call on institutions and the Government of Canada to demonstrate deep and meaningful truth and reconciliation. We call on you to divest in all of the other unsustainable projects that are threatening the health and integrity of Indigenous land and food systems. These issues are far from being resolved. Threat to our wild salmon, a cultural and ecological keystone species, is the similar kind of genocide that happened to the Plains people when the buffalo were killed off and they were starved out of their homelands. We know that Vancouver has about 100,000 Indigenous peoples who have migrated from all over Canada. And I stand in solidarity with them when I say that it is because of the disposition of our land and food system that we are here living in the downtown east side and many other really terrible poverty-stricken situations.
Climate justice is very complex, and it's connected to a long list of issues about fossil fuels.
Hi, my name's Mark Lee. I'm a senior economist with the BC office of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. I led a major research project called the Climate Justice Project, looking at how we can integrate social justice principles into climate change policies. The people who benefited most from fossil fuels that are causing climate change are not the same people who are bearing the costs of climate change.
Babies around the world are affected by climate change in different ways, and this is because, for example, here in Canada we are really lucky to have fairly clean water, clean air, abundant farmland to feed us, and a strong publicly funded healthcare system. But that's not the case for a variety of reasons in different countries around the world. So when you add in the effects of climate change, like droughts, like hurricanes, like crop failures, this disproportionately affects populations of young people living in those places because they just don't have as much resilience as we do here. So there really is the potential for populations in other countries to be much more severely affected by climate change than we are here in Canada.
Rich people in one country may benefit and poor people in another country may be at a loss, but it also spans across the time dimension as well. That we benefit now from the use of fossil fuels in powering our civilization, but the cost of using those fossil fuels because of the carbon dioxide and other pollutants that are created are borne by people in other parts of the world and well into the future. I think climate justice is an important concept because in order to have success with climate change policies that ask people to change the way they do things, we need to do it in a way to make sure that that everyone benefits, that we aren't leaving people behind, that we aren't leaving workers behind. We need to think about how the policies to address climate change affect different populations. So when we introduce a carbon tax, to recognize that this has a more adverse impact on poor households than it does rich households. So there needs to be some kind of compensation. When we're talking about how do we introduce clean energy or retrofit homes to be more energy efficient, then we need to be thinking about, well, how does this affect renters and not just owners? When we think about the impact on the workplaces, we need to make sure that there are programs in place that are creating robust and plentiful new jobs in areas that are clean and green while phasing out the jobs that are dirtier, but making sure that the workers who are in those dirty industries right now are dealt with fairly so that they have adequate income as compensation, so that they have opportunities for retraining, or if they're older workers, early retirement provisions. These are all components of making a package of reforms to make our economy truly sustainable, to make them more fair.
We saw that with COVID-19, science was demanding that we change our way of life. With climate change, science is demanding for a long time that we change our way of life. When is it going to happen? That is the question.
The economy is always changing, and governments have the ability to help shape the trajectory that economy is in. Governments have access to scientists and all kinds of experts. They know what kind of timeline the climate science imposes on them, and yet we have not really seen that translate into meaningful action. So, will that come to bear? I don't know. I think meaningful action actually challenges the vested interests of powerful corporations. I think politicians listen to those corporations more than they listen to people. And they certainly are not listening to future generations. I think the companies that are making money right now are opposed to climate justice. We see a lot of lobbying by oil and gas corporations, and not so much coal-producing corporations anymore. And they're very influential in the halls of power in the capital of British Columbia, in the capital of Canada, in Washington. They have a lot of bodies on the ground lobbying governments, making sure that their voices are heard, and that their perspectives are heard, and oftentimes they are looking to protect the interests of their shareholders, not the interests of future generations. the responses to climate change are also very complicated. So it makes it easy for politicians to pretend that they are doing things or do only minor steps when they're really not doing anywhere close to what needs to be done, particularly challenging the power of oil and gas and other fossil fuel companies. And I think that's really where we need to be going. We've been talking a lot for a whole generation about people taking individual actions and carbon taxes and making people drive a little bit less or turn their temperature down in their household a little bit less. Those have had very, very minor impacts overall. We need higher level coordination. That is, we need government leadership that steps in and takes policies, particularly regulations, that limit the amount of fossil fuels that we burn as a society, and also that limit the amount of fossil fuels that we extract. We are starting to see the impacts of climate change now, but even if we were to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to zero overnight, there would still be more temperature increase from the accumulated emissions to date. So the temperatures will continue to go up for another 30 to 40 years before they then started to stabilize. So climate change is very much a long game. The actions we take now will slightly reduce the harms faced by future generations, but the challenge of our generation is really to get to zero emissions as quickly as possible. Politicians are possibly playing a trick on people, pretending that they are taking action when they really aren't. I think the latest wave of protests that we saw, led by youth, Greta Thunberg, and a lot of great youth activists in Canada and other parts of the world, are now pointing to the next steps. And that means we need to have bodies in the street. We need to start disrupting business as usual. We need to have a way of creating more organized forms that contest power and make politicians act on these issues even when they may not want to. So that is really the next steps. And it's time for people to put pressure on politicians to take real action.
So one of the hardest things to face as a mom is recognizing that we're living in a world that is essentially falling apart. When you're reading your child a book about animals and reading the different animals, and when we got to koalas right after the Australian bushfires, and it was challenging because as you're reading out some of the animals, you know, even I've got some local books that are talking about salmon, and the salmon are declining, and grizzly bears, which are suffering from the salmon decline. It's hard to, as a parent, know that you're bringing your child into this world that's not well. It's a very sick place right now. And then furthermore, some of the effects of humans encroaching on the land of wildlife. One of the major things we're experiencing right now, the coronavirus, is said to have been quite a bit impacted by the loss of biodiversity and the fact that we were encroaching on that land, the wild land. So it's hard to piece it together, but all these things that we're facing, fires and floods and disasters, these are all connected to climate change. So a leader of one of our other local communities said something in a Facebook post. She said, if you're feeling anxious, afraid, or hopeless about climate change, the antidote is action. One exciting thing we did was for Valentine's Day, we had a social event with a photographer to take pictures of the kids, and we had a Valentine's making station where the families and the kids made Valentines, talking about what they love about the earth and asking for what they wanted for Valentine's Day from their members of parliament. And then two parents delivered them to the Minister of the Environment, his office in person. A nice big heart filled with Valentines from the kids to say, please, all we ask for this Valentine's Day is for you to look after the earth. One thing that he told us was that he wants to stand up for this, but that he needs to have other members of government also standing up. So if we could please connect with other communities and tell the people who are not already sold on the issue of climate change that they needed to change their stance and make changes.
During the beginning of the vaccination period, I followed some mothers and families to a march.
My mother was an activist. Late 50s, early 60s to 1970. My daughter, her name is Sasheen. Sasheen is an activist. When she talks to me, she says to me, Daddy, it's not about being Indian. It's about saving the water. It's about speaking up for those who don't have voice. Worms, bees, mosquitoes, deer, elk, buffalo, killer whales, big blue whales. She said it's about speaking for them. She was at Standing Rock a couple of years ago. The mercenaries, agents of the government and the oil company there, they shot my daughter 3 times with rubber bullets. Hit her chest, hit her in the back of the head.
On that day, Sean was using often a specific keyword.
The word Nutsamot. Nutsamot in the Coast Salish language simply means we are one. The bigger truth of Nutsamot is that we are one with these trees. Pigeons, crows, we're one. We are also one with our ancestors. So we need to take action. If we don't take action, we don't bring awareness. The only thing that's going to be left here is that. The word is Nutsamot. So everybody on the count of 3, Nutsamot really loud. 1, 2, 3. Nutsamot! I'm going to close with a chant.
I saved the earth.
Yes, you do save the earth.
Many people worry that if you talk about hope, that somehow you might be inadvertently allowing complacency. And that's a big worry because we know that environmental issues are real, they're urgent, they're global in scope, we need to be acting on them. But what the psychological literature shows is that you're much more likely to become apathetic, to do nothing when you feel hopeless. And you're much more likely to stick with and do the difficult things that we need to do when you feel hopeful. When you can see things like, when you can feel prideful that you're part of an action that's having a positive impact. When things like relationships and meaningful purpose turn out to be the things that allow us to keep working hard on something when it gets really hard. And when we only use fear and shame, which have been the #1 ways that we've mostly talked about the environment to try and encourage people to do something better, they're not very effective. They cause us to shut down and give up and feel like it's all hopeless. And so rather than the danger of hope, there's really more of a danger around hopelessness. And so I would say that the environmental crisis is also a crisis of hope, and that's why we need to be so focused on evidence-based solutions and amplify them in the directions we need to be going. What we really need to be doing is creating safe places for kids to share their authentic feelings, whether they're angry or frightened or mad or excited even about the state of the planet. And then how do we take those safe spaces and help children to see the very true actions that are already at play, that they can be part of, and to amplify those. So that's why we really need to be thinking about the emotional situation that children are facing and how we as adults support them. Babies just naturally love the environment. We know this from watching our own children, and also many studies now talk about the importance to our mental well-being, our emotional well-being, our physical well-being of being outside and being part of nature.
Nature is the ultimate jungle gym for children, for their mental health and their physical health at every stage in their lives. So children who spend more time in nature increase their resilience, and they reduce their rates of anxiety and depression, and they also improve their school performance and concentration. So children who spend time in nature also improve their physical health. They have lower risk of obesity, and they also are more likely to hit their physical activity targets. So overall, nature is an incredible boon for children's health in many ways. There is evidence showing that young adults and older adults who spend time in nature, either on weekend trips in the forest or short day trips, actually increase the amounts of their immunoproteins and the activity of their natural killer cells. There's actually a study I really like that looked at children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. And they looked at these children after they took them on walks for 20 minutes through a residential area, through a downtown area, or through a park. And what it showed was that children who walked through a park, their math and concentration scores after they walked for 20 minutes were significantly higher than the other two, and in fact to the level that it rivaled prescription stimulant medication. And there is also research showing that it's really your sense of whether or not you've had a meaningful experience or contact with nature that matters. So whether it is gardening in your backyard, or sitting on a park bench in a city park, or hiking up the side of a mountain, the beauty of spending time in nature is that it's really accessible to anyone, with any interests and with any physical capabilities, and really who lives anywhere.
So this whole movement of livable cities, which is talking much more now about putting people first rather than cars first, is a real movement that is really important for mothers to be behind, because it's better for kids, it allows them more freedom, and it's better for the environment. And interesting statistics like when there's more trees on a street, there's less crime on a street. So all kinds of things around urban forests and other livable cities initiatives are ones that mothers have been very involved in, and I know will continue to be involved in.
Protecting parks and wild spaces is one of the most important things we can do for people and the planet right now, because it has what we call co-benefits. So for example, increasing green spaces in cities both reduces the urban heat island effect and also improves the mental health and physical health of people who live nearby. Increasing our wild spaces, protecting our parks and forests, improves their ability to act as carbon sinks, serves as an important source of recreation and stress reduction for people. And protecting and enhancing our coastal wetlands also improves our resilience against future sea level rise and also flooding events, while providing an important source of recreation for people who want to explore nature. So protecting and expanding our parks and wild spaces both improve human health and improve planetary health.
And so one of the things that we want to do as parents is spend as much time as possible with babies outside, and then also be thinking about how do we share our views of this planet with those children. So I think one of the really important things is talking about the fact that we just are nature. You know, the very air I'm breathing at this moment, I'm breathing because of all the phytoplankton, the tiny plants in the ocean that are creating oxygen. And that same phytoplankton is also dealing with climate change. You know, it's capturing carbon. And so I think when we are thinking about the way we engage children, we want to be showing these deep interconnections that we have with nature, and we want to be keeping track of trends that are moving in a positive direction, so that the concerns that we have about the state of the planet are real, but so too are things that are moving in a good direction. I think one of our big challenges is to tell the story of what things were like and how they're changing. And we do that all the time as moms. We talk to our kids about how they themselves are changing. I find it really important to talk to little children about things that I care about, that they care about. I often say to them, you know, when I was your age, if I'm talking to someone really little, we never saw bald eagles here in British Columbia at all. And now when I go into any classroom in British Columbia along the coast and say to them, how many of you saw a bald eagle? I used to say this last month, now I say in the last week. Here along the west coast of Canada, there's been an increase of humpback whales and gray whales. Some humpback populations are near historic levels, and the International Monetary Fund has now put a price tag in terms of carbon capture on those whales, $2 million per whale. So when we think about it, and we think and talk to children, that this restoration of the planet is also going on, and that's a positive thing for climate change.
We live still on a very beautiful and wonderful earth. Every child that comes onto this planet opens their eyes, and there's hope and there's love in their spirit. Somehow we've got to find a way not to damp that down, but to encourage it. So together we find the means to bring humanity forward into maturity, into looking after our earth, all who live on it, certainly ourselves. I've often been described as an arbitrary optimist, and I think it's a good label for me, because I figure if you're going to take a choice, you may as well go for the hope and the possible. It doesn't mean I'm soft on things. I've devoted my whole life to trying to make this a better world in the face of some pretty difficult odds.
For 30 years, Rick has researched, negotiated, lobbied, and campaigned whatever it has taken to conserve the unparalleled landscapes of BC. This proud grandpa has protected over 8 million acres of parks and wilderness areas in British Columbia.
Why British Columbia and places with high mountains are especially important in climate change. If you think about it, species that are going to have to get to cooler climates as Earth warms up are either going to have the choice of going hundreds of kilometers north towards the poles, or if they're in a place with mountains, they can get to cooler habitat in a couple of hundred meters by going up slope. And in British Columbia, our mountains are high enough and they're still wild. We have the opportunity for wildlife to retain a future here. And the science shows us our mountains are high enough that we will retain the full array of ecosystems. It's because of this that British Columbia and British Columbia's wilderness are especially important for sanctuary. But in the end, I think what's really going to make the full evidence clear is when the economics start to change, and they are starting to change. Solar power now is cheaper than building new fossil fuel plants, coal and natural gas. We are moving through a fast transition economically, and even those who want to drag their feet and be skeptics, I think the marketplace is going to talk to them.
In between 1990 and 2019, many countries have decreased their CO2 emissions, like in the UK, Germany, France, and Italy, and so many other countries. There is a lot of statistics available, and they are showing we are in a global economic transition.
So for example, the work that I do on connecting patients to nature and prescribing nature is one way that we can improve planetary health by connecting patients to nature and improving their health and their motivation to care for it. So I think sometimes it's hard for physicians to change their practice patterns unless there's something evidence-based, and there is a lot of evidence behind the health benefits of nature. So I would love it if I could get some of my colleagues to open up their practices to include this kind of work.
Sometimes the problem of climate change can seem overwhelming and just end up getting on with our day because where to start and how to solve such big problems. But know that systems have fallen. We used to believe in the right of kings, and people thought that could never change. And now we have democracy. We can reimagine the world that we live in. And when we realize the power that we have as people power, in fact, has made states fall, made some of the biggest and most successful revolutions. And the science actually proves it, that if you have 3.5% of the population taking repeated action, you can bring down a government, you can make revolutionary change, and it's something that we see just over the horizon. When you combine the Fridays for Future and what the teenagers are doing, when you combine what the mothers are doing, when you combine all of these networks together, we can get there, and we can get there fast.
Highly recommend that all mothers and fathers do is to find their local community climate action parents group. If you don't have a parents group in your community, you can start one. Babies for Climate Action has a Facebook page that's public. Anyone can access, and we can help connect you to some different groups that are local or in North America or around the world.
The parents and grandparents I met definitively believe that the support to resuscitate the economy after the pandemic should promote health, equity, and protect nature. and not only locally, but for children around the world.